Like I said, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to share all of this with you, this hard work coming together for the fulfillment of the Masters of Conservation Leadership degree at Colorado State University. As you can see here, my capstone was focused on the Yampa River Scorecard project, and I'm going to cover a good bit of background information first about the Yampa, because I know I've got a wide audience here and a lot of maybe East Coast folks who don't know the dynamics of water in the West, and just want to make sure we're all on the same page to some degree. So let's see. There we go. In that, I will start with some background. I'll cover my project partners and give some geographic and ecological highlights to start us off, and then we'll consider social ecological systems at work in the Yampa Valley. And then from that, we'll dive into the conservation issue at hand that's central to this project and take a look at what work my partners are doing and where my capstone project fits into that. And then finally, next I'll walk through the methodology that I use and deliverables that I created and highlight some outcomes from that process. And then finally take some time to reflect on some lessons learned. And at the end, leave some time for questions from you all. So let's start with some background. My project partners is Friends of the Yampa. It's a registered 501c3 nonprofit based in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, up in the northwestern corner of the state. It was founded in 1981, really with the goal to develop widespread support for a healthy Yampa River. They do have a really small staff, very expanding a little bit, but they have limited capacity and it's difficult to expand their reach in some ways, but to be a small staff, they are very mighty. They do a lot of really impactful work regardless. And their mission here, I've got written, it's to protect and enhance the environmental and recreational integrity of the Yampa River and its tributaries through stewardship, advocacy, education, and partnership. But really just big picture here before I dive into the rest of what I did with Friends of the Yampa and through that process. I supported their efforts on the Yampa River Scorecard project. They're leading this project with a lot of other partners and agencies. But what I did with them was I created an ArcGIS story map that'll be housed on the Scorecard website as an interactive and educational tool. The story map's an immersive tour of the Scorecard project itself and the sections that feature major themes from interviews that I conducted with stakeholders. But just a quick note on the imagery and photos that you'll see in this presentation, they're from all taken by Kent Vertrees, who is a big time friend of the Yampa. He's been their executive director off and on for many years, but he's a big recreation person and just very supportive, and love the photos that you'll get to see. So let's get started with some geographic orientation using watershed boundaries and starting really big picture here with this map of the Colorado River Basin to give you an idea of scale. If you can see my cursor here, the Yampa River up here in Northwest Colorado is a major tributary of the Green River that flows through Utah. And the Green River is the largest tributary of the Colorado River. So just as we're mostly all aware, the intense drought that the Colorado River Basin has been feeling for the last 20 years is really widespread and continuing to intensify with climate change conditions. We're just seeing higher and higher temperatures in the water and lower precipitation levels, and that complicates just about everything that is going to follow. So the Colorado River provides water to roughly 40 million people in 7 states, and including Mexico, and Mexico in addition. But the water politics of the Colorado River system is just mind-boggling. It's incredibly complex. I won't dive too deep into that here, but there are a couple things that are key to know for my capstone itself. But back in the 1860s, the Colorado Doctrine was established, and that created the water law framework in the state and along the river. But in this doctrine, the concept of water rights was established. and it's called the Doctrine of Prior Appropriation. So the doctrine details who's entitled to use how much water and for what uses. It's often summarized as first in time, first in right, meaning that the first person to take water from the river and put it to beneficial use has the first rights to that water allocation. So this water system is central today to water users and differentiates senior water rights holder from junior water rights holders and the allocation amounts that people have. So let's zoom into Colorado. There are 9 major river basins in the state, and the arrows here give you an idea of just how much water flows from each basin and to where. And these correlate with the 9 basin roundtables in the state. But I'll get into a little bit more about that in the governance section. But what I really want to highlight here is this black line, the divide between the east slope and west slope. You've got the Front Range here with much higher population and a lot more demand for water use, but that does kind of create a tension between water users in the state and those basin roundtables when they're planning for water, if water has to get diverted across the mountains to the Front Range. But just taking a look at the numbers in the boxes down here, you can see on the west slope, the population is just a fraction of that. On the east slope, and irrigated acres also a fraction of that. But in total, the amount of water that flows out of the west slope is about 8 million acre feet per year versus the 1.3 million acre feet per year that flow out of the east slope. So distribution of the water resources and people is very disproportionate. So in the Yampa River Basin itself, this map on the left shows you boundaries. You've got the Wyoming and Utah state lines, but it shows the different counties and major cities. And here we really want to look at Drought County, where Steamboat Springs is, and Moffat County, home to Craig. Craig right here. But they're 2 very different counties politically, economically. Also, you see a lot of different management, but I like this second map because it just gives a clear picture of the course of the Yampa itself, not very detailed, but you can see my little red stars at the headwaters in the confluence, but flowing north and west once it hits Steamboat into the confluence with the Green River. And some of the major tributaries, Little Snake and Elk River, are also something to be aware of. But the protected areas, there are 2 protected areas that I want to highlight. The headwaters of the Yampa is in Route National Forest in the Flat Tops Wilderness area. Pictured here, you can see the young wee little Yampa flowing through a very different ecosystem from where it ends up at the confluence with the Green River and Dinosaur National Monument, right on the Colorado-Utah state line. And this is just really incredible photo, I think, of the confluence. But you can see the Green River here, muddier, where the Yampa River meets it and then goes around the bend of Steamboat Rock and flows on into Utah. And I want to highlight some unique features of the Yampa River. It is unique because it's a model of a healthy river system. It remains intact and free of major dams and diversions, which makes it one of the last free-flowing rivers in the entire Colorado River system. So this term free-flowing is sometimes debated because there are very small reservoirs in the headwaters area of the river, but no large reservoirs like the scale which we see all throughout other river systems on the Colorado, but there are some small agricultural and municipal industrial diversions up and down the river, but nothing so large as to alter that natural hydrograph of the river. And this picture here on the right shows some evidence of river movement. Back to a hydrograph. I'll talk more about it later on, but just to let you know what it is, it's the rate of water flows over time. And the Yampas is natural because it maintains that cycle of peak flows from snowmelt in late spring, but again, nothing so large as to alter the natural hydrograph of the river. But because of that natural state in certain stretches, you can clearly see the evidence of river movement, like the floodplain here. Generally human disturbances that cause erosion, like straightening a channel or dams and bridges, can cause river movement, but the movement here is naturally occurring due to flooding. And towards the bottom, you can see the scars of the oxbows, these large bends, and the scars from where the river previously flowed through, and then from flooding events and over time moved to where it is, you can see here. But another unique feature, the rich biodiversity of the aquatic systems. There is a whole slew of rare flora and fauna. The riparian forest, this isn't the exact riparian forest, but it's found in the stretch of river. It's called the Cottonwood Floodplain Forest, and pictured is recognized as a globally rare ecosystem. But in terms of faunal biodiversity, this stretch is home to over 150 neotropical migratory bird species. It's a staging ground for the annual sandhill crane migrations. And the aquatic communities it supports are just as rich. It's home to the Yampa itself is home to 3 different federally endangered fish species, the bony-tailed chub, razorback sucker, and the Colorado pike minnow. It did used to include the humpback chub, but that was actually delisted, not delisted, but downlisted to threatened back in October, which was kind of a big deal in the whole community. But I just want to say that you would think the unique features and sheer amount of biodiversity should be a testament in and of itself why the Yampa River is so remarkable and worthy of protection. But of course, we have to understand that these outstanding ecological features don't exist in a vacuum. We'll consider some social ecological components. These social components that influence the Yampa River system give us a wider perspective of what we're up against, what we're facing. But it's really established that water systems and watershed management is not only a natural physical science, but it's also a social science. So I pulled a quote from the Lit Review that I think really gets at that idea very well. But Lund 2015 states that the consideration of physical sciences as a sole basis for water management faces many limitations. Water management is a societal activity driven by social objectives. So let's take a look at the economic side of things. The Yampa River supports so many livelihoods in the region, and definitely the well-being of every single person. But since clean water is crucial for life, we know that economic considerations are also a huge component of that, as well as the ecosystem services that the Yampa River provides. It's just paramount. There are 2 really huge water dependent livelihoods in the region, being agriculture and recreation. But in terms of well-being, it's also an enormous public health benefit to have the municipal facilities that supply clean drinking water and stormwater control and wastewater treatment. But you've also got the industrial sector using water from the Yampa to provide energy to the region. And let's take a glance at the numbers of water use by sector. And this is at the state level, but it's pretty representative of the Yampa Basin as well. Agriculture by far and away uses the most at 87%, and the ag sector goes towards crop irrigation, mostly hay for cattle production. But the infrastructure that diverts and stores that water has to be maintained so as not to flood the ranch or their neighbors or just the whole ecosystem at large. But a head gate for a ditch diversion is pictured here on the left. You've got some folks out inspecting. The next use is municipal and industrial use, which is at 7% just about. And these 2 uses are consumptive uses, meaning that the water is for the most part permanently removed from the system. There's no reuse involved or little reuse involved. But on the other hand, you've got non-consumptive uses that leave water in the system, and that's for the benefit of things like recreation in the environment. And that involves something called in-stream flows, important to know for livelihoods when I talk about that a little more, but that use is at about 6%. So each of these sectors supply a lot of jobs in the region, obviously dependent on a stable water supply, but agriculture not only supplies food to the region, many folks view it as a cultural mainstay as well. The recreation opportunities draw tons of people to the area from skiing and paddling and fishing, but there are a lot of outfitters to support that who depend on that as their livelihood. But it's also worth noting here that coal is a huge part of Moffat County, and that is obviously changing in this day and age. The Hayden Station pictured here is a coal-fired power plant in the process of shutting down, and it will have its doors closed by 2028. And that means that a far-reaching economic shift is coming, and that will be necessary. There is by no means an easy or one size fits all solution, but many are looking to leverage the recreation and tourism opportunities that Moffat County and the Yampa River can provide, especially with Dinosaur National Monument being right next door and wanting to shift some of that weight into the recreation sector. Let's shift into some governance structures and the policies that coincide. One big actor is the Colorado Water Conservation Board. It's a subset of the state's Department of Natural Resources, and really the core of their work is to conserve and manage Colorado's water now and in the future, but it's an influential governing body to water conservation processes, largely because CWCB gives technical and financial assistance to the next two areas I'm going to talk about. But the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act was passed in 2005, and it was a response to a severe drought throughout the state in 2002 and 2003. But the act established 9 basin roundtables in the state, and these are essentially stakeholder working groups. Some of you are really familiar with the Basin Roundtable process. We did that for our collaborative conservation situation assessment we did back in the spring semester. But there are representatives from all stakeholder areas on each Basin Roundtable, agriculture, recreation, industry, and largely these groups were tasked with making locally informed water management plans. And those are called Basin Implementation Plans, which informed this next part, the Colorado Water Plan, and that was released in 2015. So each Basin Roundtable created one of these, and the group responsible for creating the Yampas was the Yampa, or is the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable. And a note here on that process, I really learned in my interviews that I conducted that the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act, that was kind of the beginning of the work of the Basin Roundtable. And it was a little bit of a contentious process at first. Essentially, it just created a paradigm shift in the approach to water conservation, it really being a grassroots process. But I did hear from a few folks that it really transformed the thinking and interactions around water management in the basin. And this is a really unique grassroots process because in most other states, water planning is done at the state agency level. So without that process, it's kind of doubtful that the collaborative atmosphere would really exist in the way that it does today. And things like the Yampa River Scorecard project would not be as feasible. So after all of that, let's take a look at the conservation challenges that are facing the Yampa River. And just a caveat, bear with me, I am going to show some sort of doom and gloom graphs, maps, and headlines, but throughout, just keep in mind that there are really many people working tirelessly to create solutions to the challenges they're facing. So the drought that is gripping much of the West has obviously not escaped the Yampa River. It's been really especially tough this past 2021 season. Colorado is a water scarce state, and it's just seen reoccurring drought conditions for the past 20 years or so. And we're also seeing a growing population across the state, meaning more development and demand for those already scarce resources. But to add to that, the climate uncertainty, we're seeing rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns, but also diminishing snowpack levels. So these sort of conditions reduce stream flow, they deplete soil moisture, and the groundwater that's necessary. And it's felt really in every corner of the state, not only economically, but also ecologically. So this map here is from the Colorado or the US Drought Monitor, just isolating Colorado. And it's updated it's updated weekly, but this is from a 7-day window back in the early September. And the map looked like this for much of the summer and fall, with a lot of this red and orange in the state, meaning severe or extreme drought. But this shows, you can see in the northwest corner, that dark orange, meaning exceptional drought. So to that point, a combination of high temperatures and low flows creates conditions that are really not favorable for any part of the river system. And first, this figure here shows mean temperatures throughout the state and the data from the summer months of this year. And you can just see the scale, the right with record warmest at the top. And you look at the northwest corner with much of Moffat and Routt counties just inundated with that record warmest. This translates to higher water temperatures as well. The second figure here is a stream flow duration hydrograph and shows the monthly percentile classes in these colors. But this shows the last 2 years of data. The black line that shows the flow data, you can track that and look and see much of last fall and winter. And this spring and summer, the flow has been just in this brown and orangey colors below normal and much below normal. Even one part here falling below that lowest 10th percentile range. So high temperatures and low flows are just not a good combination, like I mentioned. So as a result of that, we've seen in recent years some really unprecedented measures in the realm of water politics. We saw for the first time in history, the Yampa River was placed on call back in 2018. And then we saw this happen again back in 2020, and then once more this past summer, just briefly. But like I said, this is really unprecedented, all this happening for the first time in history within the past 4 or 5-ish years. But a call on the river happens when there isn't enough water in the river for water rights holders to receive their allocated amounts. So after that spring peak in flows, the river drops to base flows. And if those base flows hit a critically low level, we'll see this happen. In this case, rights holders can call for their water based on that first in time, first in right priority system. And the senior water rights holders will receive their allocation, but not necessarily everyone else. And this really notably impacts the agricultural community. But recreation feels the sting of this as well. For example, very early this past spring and in the summer as well, Colorado Parks and Wildlife announced a couple of widespread closures to different recreation along the Yampa. On May 24th, CPW announced an emergency fishing closure on high use areas. And then on July 8th, they enacted a commercial and voluntary recreational closure on the river, which means that all the commercial outfitters who support tubing, rafting, stand-up paddleboarding trips or fishing trips had to stop sending trips down the river. And they really had to do this because the low flows and high temperatures create a really stressful environment for aquatic communities, namely the fish, but added pressure from anglers and boaters can be detrimental in the long term. You can tell my crudely taken pictures. You would see these signs right here on the left. They were at essentially every little spur trail or anywhere you can access the river, and partner with the city of Steamboat Springs and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, just educating people on why the river was closed to recreation, and in hopes that people would abide. And then this picture I took in the shop of a river outfitter, who some people would shy away from the topic of climate change, but they really wanted to make it known that this is what's happening, and really open up that conversation about what these conditions mean for right now and in the future. So knowing all of that, this really just underscores the importance of the conservation work that Friends of the Yampa is doing and other just very dedicated and thoughtful people. So let's take a minute to look at some of that work and then get into how this capstone supports that work. So starting big picture, generally there's a tool known as river report cards. They're a commonly used tool to capture many components of the health of a watershed and particular river system that communities depend on as a resource. But river report cards compile and measure a ton of specific data. And the three major areas are ecological, social, and economic. But river report cards are distinctive because they really are a great example of the adaptive management process in action. River report cards require continual planning and taking tabs on what's working, what's not working, monitoring and upkeep of the data, and then adapting the process to stay effective and efficient. So these two figures here on the bottom are from World Wildlife Fund. They created a practitioner's guide to developing river report cards, and they detail the process very, very thoroughly. So specifically, Friends of the Yampa they started their own river report card this past year called the Yampa River Scorecard Project. And the Scorecard Project is highly collaborative, lots and lots of partners involved, either through the technical committee, we've got stakeholder focus groups and some agencies even providing additional technical support or financial support as well. But the three main study areas of the Yampa River Scorecard Project are ecological health and function, ecosystem services and uses, and finally, people and community benefits. But the overarching goal of the Scorecard Project is to convey science and river management in a way, to all people in a fun and exciting way that stimulates community awareness, engagement with the Yampa River and its unique attributes. So the Scorecard Project it's in its first iteration right now. It'll be replicated on other sections of the river, but it's focused on a pilot stretch from the town of Hayden to the town of Craig, and then it'll be adapted and implemented further in years to come. So this is a starting point right now, but that geographic section, the segment that they're doing, that's where I focus my interviews. A little bit more about back up to river report cards in general and what they aim to achieve. Here on the left, the World Wildlife Fund Practitioner's Guide, again, from their processes, they showed some specific benefits that come from report cards. And the two that I really want to highlight here are the two main outcomes that my capstone is leveraging and hopes to increase overall for the Scorecard Project. But given feedback from folks who have created report cards and published, we see that 87% of those responded that the river report cards increase public awareness of the issues, and also 84% responded that the report cards increase the demand for additional information. And this figure here, well, just to go back to that, the story map that I've created aims to do a combination of these two things. It acts as a public engagement tool and to increase the awareness of the issues that I hashed out earlier, but to simultaneously provide a lot more additional information like planning and management documents or other outside resources for folks to access and learn a lot more. But here on the right is an example of what a finished summary of results can look like. This is from another organization that completed their first iteration, the Friends of the Verde in Arizona. But you can see the general study areas broken down further into categories and indicators that are measured, and these each contribute to that next tier, finally culminating with an average grade, a very average grade, you can see here. But I mentioned those two outcome areas. Largely, the purpose of my capstone is to foster a sense of ownership with the stakeholders who are engaged in the process of the Scorecard Project. And additionally, I really want to promote engagement from community members and the general public who are really curious and want to learn more. But I'm doing this by providing a unique medium for understanding the science and study areas of the scorecard, as well as unique features of the river. And ultimately, I just want to develop a sense of connection from the audience with a connection to the conservation needs of the river. There are, I promise you, a lot more detailed goals and outcomes. We won't get into those for the sake of time, but just know they exist and know that they changed really every single day of this project. Like I mentioned earlier, for my deliverable, I created a story map to detail the scorecard process and stakeholder input I solicited. But in terms of the methodology I used in the process of creating that story map, there were 3 phases and 3 distinct activities and outcomes for each. But those phases were first to conduct interviews, and then I coded those interviews. And then finally, from the results, that code book, I built a narrative to share through the story map medium. The design and methodology were informed by a lit review that was captured in the annotated bibliography, but I just wanted to bring in a couple of key pieces here that relate to best practices for storylines for water communication and or water conservation and communication tactics for those storylines. Arvello et al. 2019 states or suggests that a clear protagonist portrayed in your storyline can help develop a sense of connection to the story itself and what's happening on the ground. And then sort of in tandem with that, the World Wildlife Fund Practitioner's Guide, they suggest taking feature reporters on a trip to key stretches of the river and introduce them to people who depend on the river basin's health. And sometimes that's possible, but I just wanted to make that possible for a larger audience and people who can't visit these places or hear directly from the people that depend on the river themselves, that are people they might not have talked to otherwise. So these are kind of our protagonists of sorts. Given that, let's take a look a little more in depth at each phase of the methodology. So phase 1 included conducting interviews, and this really involved creating interview scripts, identifying folks to interview, and then conducting those interviews. I first drafted a set of interview questions specific to individual stakeholder groups like ag, recreation, environment. But then I took those drafts to a handful of conservation practitioners in the different stakeholder areas specific to the Yampa Valley. And really the goal of those practitioner interviews was to consult and get their feedback on specific questions to ask stakeholders. So to create specific questions, I'd want to ask ranchers or other ag folks specific questions for recreation outfitters, and then environmentally specific questions as well. So these were with individuals from a handful of organizations. Some of these are partners on the Scorecard project. Community Ag Alliance, Trout Unlimited, and Nature Conservancy were just a couple. But after that consultation phase, I altered the main sets of questions given their feedback and interviewed individual stakeholders. And the goal with these interviews, they were semi-structured, but the goal was to collect historical accounts and stories, as well as individual perspectives on different management techniques or practices, and also to get a sense of their personal definition of what a healthy river means, since the healthy river is the cornerstone of the Scorecard project and what it's trying to achieve and communicate. But these, like I mentioned, were semi-structured interviews. I had a set of questions that I asked everyone, and then however that went, let individuals share their own stories and insights that they thought would be most relevant. So here are a few examples of questions I asked during each interview. I asked folks to describe how your ability to make a living depends on the river. Asked what a healthy Yampa River means to you. In recent years, have you seen changes in the river? And then in 20 years from now, what would a healthy Yampa River look like to you? I then coded those interviews, transcribed and coded to identify major themes, lots of sub-themes. This figure just shows a handful of the themes that came up many, many times throughout in every single conversation, but I'll show some quotes and insight from some of these major themes in just a little bit, but some that I thought were highly relevant and worth sharing. You've got a healthy river, and some sub-themes that go along with that are allyship and common goals, climatic conditions of drought and climate change sub-themes, management perspectives, talking about water storage or non-native invasive species. Water rights obviously came up every other minute, it felt like, but water rights, you've got in-stream flows and priority. And then COVID-19, a lot of folks talked about how that either brought a lot more people in for recreation or impacted different markets that they were relying on. But on to phase 3, after comparing the major themes from the coded transcripts, I translated that into a narrative of those themes, and it was a basis from those stakeholder groups I used to create the interactive components of the story map, which is largely a couple of map tours and then timelines. And the intention here was to have an overarching narrative that shows how complex the myriad of different water uses on the river are, and then at the same time, what those challenges are the river faces with all of those different water uses. So that narrative is captured in this deliverable, a story map. It's just kind of like a website, but way cooler. The story map will be housed on the scorecard website itself. It's still under revision with my project partners, and then also the first iteration of the scorecard project as well is still underway. But when the story map's published, you'll be able to find it on the scorecard website. Stay tuned, reach out, ask if you want to see the full project. But this is just a little preview of the intro page and the toolbar that'll navigate you to the different sections, so you can just kind of see what some of the first sections are. So the scorecard, I wanted to capture the whole process of the scorecard and make that the first half. I just wanted to make sure that the audience knows all of the key pieces of the scorecard process and then some. The story map has 4 major sections. The first 2, like I said, are very general, and they're informed by the work of the technical committee and the stakeholder working groups. That consists of the first section is scorecard goals and outcomes and highlights a little bit of the process involved. And then the next section is the geographic and ecological features, some of which I showed you earlier. But the next 2 sections are capstone specific, and they're from my interviews in those major themes. But the section 3 is a series of interactive map tours of major themes identified through the stakeholder interviews. And there's a map tour for each stakeholder area, including important themes that they brought up and described. And then finally, section 4, I created an interactive timeline based on events that interviewees described and highlighted. And it includes things like major legislation or major drought or flood events. And in both of these sections, I provide links to outside resources, websites, planning documents, management plans, where folks can learn more and connect to the work at large in the Yampa. But since the overarching goal of the scorecard project is to convey river health, I wanted to highlight some quotes from stakeholders about what they think a healthy river is, what it means to them, and how that looks. But from an ag producer, I heard that a healthy river makes us all healthy. And for me, a healthy river means I can produce a ton of hay per acre for my cows. Recreation-wise, I heard that a healthy river means that you can see the impact up and down the valley. It means good snowpack, a nice flow fully to the banks. It's sustainable, lots of water. It's less allocations and diverting less water out of the river. Truly, on a good water year, everybody is happy. And then from the environmental perspective, I heard we've got the 4 endangered species, the declining and threatened species, the riparian forest, and the hydrograph of the river. So a healthy river to me requires that we meet the needs of all those attributes and the needs of everything else. And if we can't do that, we're failing. Another major theme, livelihoods really dependent on a healthy river. They're inextricably linked to river health. But again, from the ag perspective, we heard, or I heard, hopefully people will be able to continue making a living out here. We can't get rich off of it, but we do need to be able to make a living off of it. We need to keep the tractors running, keep the horse trailers moving, keep the buildings in repair. We need to be able to go down and dig out our ditch. We need to be able to fix that head gate when it crashes. We need to be nimble and always forward looking. And then finally, from the recreation perspective on livelihoods, obviously they need water in the river, or else those sort of recreation closures that we saw this summer happen. But in-stream water rights are very important to us. Water in the river is what we rely on. And as we see less snowpack, we see less recreation, and that impacts our business humongously. Again, I heard water in the river is so central to my business. I need CFS in the river. Without CFS in there, it seriously hurts my business. CFS is cubic feet per second, it's just a measurement of flow. But with that, my hope is that the scorecard project and my role with it can help people understand what river health means, what livelihoods are dependent, and how they can help support the process. But I really just want to take some time to wrap up, give some recommendations. I think major conclusion, if nothing else, if you didn't learn anything else, main takeaway would be that a healthy river looks different to everyone, every individual. And really it is an effort to unify all of those ideals and visions. There are some unifying features of a healthy river, obviously water in the river, and that is also to support livelihoods and well-being, but especially the need to do that during uncertainties and changing climatic conditions. In terms of recommendations, if this work were to continue beyond me, like the story map component, I'd love to see an archive of stories built up and collected from folks all up and down the river, spanning many generations. I would definitely recommend an emphasis on ag folks too. I think would be really beneficial, since we hear a lot from environment and recreation folks on the Friends of the Yampa side of things. And I did work to tailor, try and get more ag feedback, but it's not easy to do it when they're out there all day, every day, not really on their computer. But I think moving forward, when the first iteration of the scorecard results are ready to share, it would be awesome to add those results to the story map potentially, and have that be sort of a template for other iterations of the scorecard, to include stories from the different sections of the river that it focuses on. But I think my main recommendation would be to push for greater coordination and communication from project partners. I think especially keeping updated on the progress of the scorecard findings is really beneficial to the process overall. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how this first iteration of the scorecard turns out, what the story map turns out to be, or what it's able to accomplish in terms of providing more resources, providing more connections to people who engage with the project. And then I just wanted to take a little bit of time. After all of that, it was a lot to get through, but also a lot of work over the last several months. And I think it's a process that really deserves some reflections and thinking about what lessons I learned along the way. But I just wanted to start on kind of a note of relating to self-awareness, since that's one of our major key characteristics of conservation leaders. But just as I reflect on the whole process, I'm really kind of blown away by how naive I was towards the beginning to think that really it was a good idea for me to dive in and learn the complexity of water in the West and water politics of the Colorado River. I think I was really in over my head a lot of the time, just trying to grapple with the complexity of the system. But in the end, I think given that, I ultimately proved to myself my capabilities as a systems thinker, and I think that can be translated well to other projects and other situations. But that was not an easy thing to grapple with. Another thing is that this project was largely self-driven, as I know a number of Capstone projects were, but overall communication was a big challenge, mostly just in getting responses from folks involved and maintaining momentum even when I wasn't getting responses. So I think it really was a lesson in trying to keep people engaged when they've got a million things on their plate. I think most of the time when a decision needed to be made and I either felt ill-equipped or not ready to make decisions, I learned kind of a difference between those two situations, where I need to reach out for help or when I need to just mush on and make decisions because I know more than I think I know. But I definitely learned to push through uncertainty, and by no means am I comfortable with uncertainty yet, but a lot more familiar with that feeling feels like and what it feels like to push through uncertainty. And I think finally, last reflection is just, I hope that you can tell by this point that I really have a profound admiration for the Yampa River. I just think it's an incredible system to marvel at, one of the most beautiful and special places. And that remembering that and keeping that in mind is what kept me motivated and wanting to ultimately turn out something that would support the river. But in that realm, these two photos are from my campsite on my last night in the Yampa Valley. And I think it just shows two kind of expressions of gratitude that I have and felt in the moment. So speaking of gratitude, I just wanted to say thank you all so much who helped me out through this process every single step of the way. Brett as my advisor who fielded all my questions and concerns, Lindsay and Kent at Friends of the Yampa who were really genuinely excited to help involve me in this incredible work along the Yampa, and then friends and family and mentors who lifted me up along the way, helped me keep moving along in the process. And another big thank you to every one of you who could make it here today, everyone who could stay on. I think it's really special to just see all this support and share what I learned and did with you. So with that, I will take your questions, and please go easy on me, but that's